The sun rises slowly over the Sierra Madre Mountains, brushing the peaks with a pale gold glow. Mist hangs low over the valleys, wrapping the small town of Badiraguato, Sinaloa, in a blanket of quiet mystery. Roosters call from distant farms, the sound echoing softly against the hills. It's the kind of dawn that feels eternal, peaceful, timeless, almost sacred. But from this same land of stillness and beauty would one day emerge a man whose name would whisper through the darkest corridors of Mexico's underworld. A man known as El Azul, the quiet narco who survived every war. In these first light hours, life in Badiraguato is simple. Families wake to grind corn for tortillas, children fetch water from the stream, and men saddle their horses to tend to cattle or fields. The roads are dusty, unpaved, marked by the slow rhythm of country life. This is the birthplace of many infamous figures, but in the early 1950s, no one could have guessed that one of the newborns in these hills would one day become one of the most elusive men in cartel history. Juan José Esparragoza Moreno was born into this quiet simplicity, a world far removed from the violence and empire that would later surround his name. The mornings in the Sierra have a way of hiding secrets. Fog rolls through the valleys, covering everything in silver-gray silence. It is in this atmosphere that the imagination begins to wander. Perhaps the landscape itself teaches those who grow up here the art of concealment. The mountains are both home and fortress, generous yet treacherous. They cradle their children close, but they also teach them to survive. For the young Juan José, life in Sinaloa was defined by hard work, loyalty, and endurance, values that would later become his greatest weapons. As the story unfolds, imagine a small boy trailing behind his father through the fields, the smell of wet earth filling the air after a night of rain. His hands are small, his eyes sharp. He listens more than he speaks. In a town where talking too much can bring trouble, silence is a kind of wisdom. Those who know how to stay quiet, how to blend in, how to wait, these are the ones who live longest. Even then, in the innocence of youth, the seeds of discretion were being planted in him. The Esparragoza family lived a modest life. They were not wealthy landowners or powerful figures, just another family among many trying to survive the uncertainty of rural Mexico. The 1950s were years of change, when modernity began to touch even the remotest corners of Sinaloa. But with change came opportunity, and danger. Smuggling routes, once used for harmless trade, started to carry new cargo. Marijuana and opium poppy fields began to replace corn and beans in the hills. Money flowed in from faraway cities, and whispers spread through the cantinas about men who had grown rich overnight. It was the beginning of something vast and unseen, a network of ambition that would one day define the entire region. The young Juan José watched this transformation quietly. He was not a reckless dreamer or a show-off. Those who knew him described him as disciplined, measured, always in control of his emotions. In a place where tempers often led to tragedy, that calmness stood out. He learned early that patience was not weakness, it was power. In the countryside, where every decision could mean life or death, waiting for the right moment was a skill that few mastered. That skill would become the essence of who he was. The days were long and filled with labor. The smell of dust mixed with the scent of sun-baked agave. The sounds of insects, distant church bells, and murmured conversations painted the soundtrack of his childhood. There was no luxury here, no comfort beyond the shade of a tree or the cool water of the river. But there was also pride. People in Sinaloa have always carried themselves with a quiet dignity, forged in hardship. They do not bow easily to fear. This environment shaped Juan José, not into a man of violence, but into one of survival. As night falls in these mountains, the world grows still again. The stars emerge by the thousands, scattering across the sky like grains of salt. Somewhere in the darkness, a child lies awake, listening to the sounds of crickets and the whispering wind. Maybe he dreams of a bigger world beyond these hills, of Mexico City, of the north, of opportunities that lie beyond the horizon. Or maybe he simply dreams of safety, of providing for those he loves. It's difficult to know when ambition becomes destiny, or when survival turns into strategy. The older villagers would sit by the fire and tell stories, some true, some invented, about men who crossed the border and came back with pockets full of dollars. About trucks that traveled at night with cargo no one dared to name. About men who rose quickly, and others who disappeared without a trace. The young boy listened, learning that power was never about noise or strength, it was about presence, about knowing when to appear and when to vanish. Years later, those same lessons would guide him through the labyrinth of Mexico's underworld, where silence could save your life and a single word could destroy it. Badiraguato has been called the cradle of the narco world, but it is also a place of deep contradictions. Beauty and danger coexist here like twin spirits. The hills are full of wildflowers and secrets, the rivers pure and yet carrying whispers of blood. It is a land that gives birth to dreamers and fugitives alike. For Juan José, it was both origin and destiny, the soil that would feed his rise and, in many ways, his myth. As the first section of his story closes, the listener is left with a tranquil image, morning returning once again to the mountains, the light spilling over fields and streams. The people of Sinaloa wake to another day, just as they have for generations. Somewhere among them, a boy grows into a man. He doesn't yet know that his path will cross with legends and empires, nor that his greatest strength will always be his silence. The dawn fades into day, the mist dissolves, and life goes on. But deep in the heart of the Sierra, the story of El Azul is just beginning. The afternoons in Sinaloa carry a special kind of stillness, a heat so thick it feels alive, pressing gently against the skin. Dust hangs in the air like gold powder, drifting from the hooves of cattle and the slow footsteps of men crossing the dry fields. In this quiet world, young Juan José Esparragoza learned the language of patience and labor. His family worked honestly, raising animals and tending small plots of land, the rhythm of their lives guided by the sun. Every sunrise meant work, every sunset meant rest. But beneath that peaceful routine, something else was forming, an invisible current of ambition, a pull towards something larger than the boundaries of his small town. He was not born into power. There were no rich relatives, no political connections, no inherited fortune. The Esparragozas were like thousands of other rural families, shaped by hardship and simplicity. They lived by the seasons, earning just enough to survive. Yet even in those humble conditions, the young boy's eyes were sharp. He noticed everything, the trucks that arrived from distant cities, the men who wore nicer boots than they could afford, the strangers who came and went in the night. In small towns, gossip travels fast, but not everything said aloud is true. The real stories live in whispers, exchanged carefully between trusted friends. It was in those quiet whispers that he first heard about the other world, the one that existed beyond the reach of the law. As he grew older, he began helping his father with livestock trading. The work took him from one village to another, giving him a glimpse of life beyond Badiraguato. He learned how to bargain, how to read faces, how to tell when someone was lying. In the markets, deals were struck not just with words but with glances and silences. Every transaction was a lesson in human behavior. Those early years taught him that success depended not on force, but on understanding. On knowing people, their needs, their fears, their greed. This was the quiet education that would one day make him one of the most effective negotiators in the criminal world. Sinaloa in those years was a land divided between beauty and struggle. The mountains gave life but also trapped it. Opportunities were scarce, and the government's presence was little more than a rumor. For many young men, the choice was clear: stay and suffer poverty, or take a risk and seek fortune elsewhere. Some joined the army, others left for the United States. But there were also those who chose another path, one lined with danger, yet shimmering with the promise of wealth. Juan José was not reckless. He didn't chase glory. But he watched, he listened, and slowly he began to understand the unwritten rules that governed this world. By the time he reached his late teens, the narcotics trade in Sinaloa was beginning to take shape. What started as small-scale marijuana cultivation had grown into something organized, sophisticated, almost industrial. Smugglers used hidden routes through the mountains, carrying loads northward toward the border. Each journey was a test of courage and luck. Violence was not yet as rampant as it would become, but everyone knew the risk: betrayal, prison, or death. Still, for those who succeeded, the rewards were beyond imagination. To a boy who had grown up watching his family work tirelessly for so little, the sight of men returning from the border in new trucks, with clean clothes and heavy wallets, must have been unforgettable. But there was something different about Juan José. Even in a world that rewarded boldness, he preferred quiet observation. Where others talked, he listened. Where others sought attention, he stayed in the background. This trait made him seem invisible, a shadow among louder men. Yet invisibility was precisely what would make him powerful. In a business built on greed and betrayal, the ones who survived longest were the ones no one noticed until it was too late. He had learned this not from books or mentors, but from life itself. The hills of Sinaloa were his classroom, and the lessons were written in blood and dust. He worked small jobs, sometimes helping with transport, other times with introductions between men who trusted few. His ability to remain calm under pressure made him valuable. He never bragged, never drew attention, and never acted without purpose. Those who dealt with him sensed something rare, a steadiness, a kind of inner discipline. In a land where temper and pride often led to violence, he carried himself differently. Some said he was too serious, too controlled. But those who watched closely could see that he was simply preparing, waiting for the right moment to move. The local cantinas were filled with talk of men who had made fortunes through la movida, the trade that no one named openly. The walls smelled of beer and tobacco, and laughter often hid the fear that lay beneath. In the corner of those rooms, a young man might sit quietly, watching the older ones toast to their success. He would listen to their stories, about risky journeys, bribes paid, betrayals survived, and he would file away every detail. He wasn't jealous. He was studying the game. Around this time, the federal police and the army began tightening control over drug cultivation, but corruption ran deep. Many agents, poorly paid and stationed far from home, turned a blind eye or even became involved themselves. The lines between right and wrong blurred. To survive in such a world required not just courage, but adaptability, the ability to shift with the changing winds. Juan José would soon find himself drawn into this complex web, where the government and the underworld were two sides of the same coin. Evenings in Sinaloa were his quiet moments. He would sit outside his small home, the air cooling after a long day's heat, watching the stars appear one by one. The sounds of distant music drifted from nearby villages, the scent of roasted corn and wood smoke carried on the wind. Life was hard but familiar, predictable. Yet something in him stirred, a restlessness that couldn't be ignored. The mountains had raised him, but they could not contain him forever. He sensed that his destiny lay beyond their slopes, in the hidden world that others only whispered about. As the years passed, the humble livestock trader became a man with connections, small ones at first, nothing remarkable. But every deal, every introduction, built another step on a staircase that led deeper into the shadows. He learned whom to trust and whom to avoid, when to speak and when to remain silent. He learned that power was not about standing tallest but about standing still while others fell. These were lessons that would define the rest of his life. The path from herds to shadows was not sudden. It was a slow drift, a quiet transformation. One day you are moving cattle across a field, the next, you are moving something else entirely, wrapped in burlap and silence. The same instincts that guided a trader, judgment, timing, negotiation, now guided a man navigating an invisible empire. In this new world, he would discover his true strength, not as a soldier, not as a killer, but as a survivor, the man who could adapt, mediate, and disappear when the fires burned too close. As the sun sets once more over the Sierra, its light turns the hills the color of old copper. The cattle wander home, bells tinkling softly in the twilight. Somewhere on a dirt road, a truck engine hums low, its driver thoughtful, quiet, aware that the world around him is changing. Juan José Esparragoza, still young but no longer innocent, looks out across the darkening landscape and feels that pull again, the call of something vast and unseen. The shadows are deepening, and soon, he will step inside them. Night descends on the dusty roads of Sinaloa, and the hum of insects fills the warm air. In the distance, faint music seeps from a cantina, mixing with the clatter of dominoes and low murmurs of men trading secrets. It is here, amid laughter and caution, that the next chapter of Juan José Esparragoza's story begins, the slow, deliberate making of El Azul. The boy from Guadalajara, once a quiet trader of cattle, now finds himself at the edges of a world that promises wealth, danger, and power beyond imagination. Yet, unlike many who rush blindly into that world, he steps lightly, watching, calculating, learning the rhythm of crime as one might learn a song. In the early 1970s, Mexico was changing. The narcotics trade, once fragmented, was beginning to organize itself into something larger and more profitable. Marijuana cultivation spread across Sinaloa's hills, hidden under thick canopies of trees. The United States demand grew, and with it came an influx of cash, dirty, intoxicating, irresistible. In towns like Culiacán and Guamuchil, a new kind of man began to appear, dressed simply but driving expensive cars, silent about his work but generous with his money. They were the smugglers, the intermediaries, the first generation of cartel men who would one day become legends. For young Juan José, this was a turning point. His early work remained modest: transport, logistics, small favors for people with connections. Sometimes it meant guiding vehicles through rural backroads where police patrols rarely ventured, other times it meant passing messages between men who never met face to face. In these moments, he developed his reputation for reliability. He didn't boast. He didn't ask questions. He delivered what was asked, precisely and quietly. In a business ruled by paranoia, this kind of discipline was rare, and people noticed. His nickname, El Azul, began to follow him more frequently now. Some said it came from the dark hue of his skin, others claimed it was his calm, cool demeanor, blue, like deep water that hides unseen depth. Whatever its origin, the name suited him perfectly. In a sea of impulsive, noisy men, he remained steady, controlled, cold in the face of chaos. He was the kind of man others underestimated, until they realized he never made mistakes. At the time, Sinaloa's traffickers operated in loosely connected networks. They worked through alliances based on trust and family ties, not yet the sprawling empires that would later dominate Mexico. But corruption was already an art form. Bribes flowed to police officers, customs agents, and local politicians who turned their gaze elsewhere. To move contraband through Mexico required more than muscle, it required coordination. Juan José's intelligence and ability to stay calm under pressure made him valuable to those seeking order in an increasingly risky trade. He soon found himself under the influence of figures like Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, men who were beginning to consolidate Mexico's drug routes into a unified system. They were older, more established, and far more flamboyant, but they recognized something rare in El Azul, a man who preferred quiet efficiency over attention. While others chased headlines and women, he focused on understanding the system, the flow of goods, money, and loyalty. He was not a gunman, he was an organizer, a strategist in the making. In one of his early missions, he was asked to oversee a convoy moving through the mountains, a test of his trustworthiness. The trucks carried not just goods but the future of his employers. A wrong turn, a nervous driver, or a curious soldier could end everything. But El Azul handled it with precision. When one of the trucks broke down, he redirected the route without panic, ensuring the cargo arrived safely. The incident reached his superiors, who noted how he solved problems without bloodshed or noise. It was the kind of success that earned quiet respect, the kind that mattered. Life in Sinaloa during those years was defined by contradictions. The same man who spent mornings praying beside his mother might spend evenings negotiating with smugglers or bribing officials. Morality blurred into necessity. To survive meant adapting to whatever role the day demanded. For El Azul, it was never about cruelty or ego, it was about stability. He had seen too many men lose everything because they confused courage with recklessness. His rise would be slow, steady, and built on trust rather than terror. As his influence grew, so did his understanding of human nature. He learned that in the drug world, loyalty was currency, and just as fragile. Men who smiled one day could betray you the next. Police who took bribes today could arrest you tomorrow if offered more. Every conversation was a calculation, every favor a potential trap. But El Azul's secret weapon was his calm. He never overreacted, never let anger cloud his mind. In meetings where tempers flared, he would sit quietly, listening until everyone else had spoken. Then, in a few measured words, he would offer a solution that satisfied all sides. That ability to bring peace to chaos became his hallmark. He began moving more freely between Culiacan and Guadalajara, the two poles of the growing trade. Guadalajara was becoming a hub, not just for business, but for connections with Colombian suppliers. Planes began to land on secret runways, carrying cocaine that would soon flood North America. The operation required meticulous organization. While others focused on expanding their reach, El Azul worked behind the curtain, building relationships, managing logistics, and, most importantly, keeping a low profile. In an industry built on ego, his humility became a shield. But danger always lurked nearby. Rivals grew jealous, police crackdowns intensified, and the web of corruption that protected traffickers occasionally tore under pressure. One wrong word, one careless associate, could bring disaster. Yet somehow, El Azul always emerged untouched. Some said he was lucky, others believed he had friends in high places. The truth was simpler, he avoided unnecessary risks. He never displayed wealth, never drew attention, and never underestimated anyone. In the late 1970s, a key turning point arrived. He was introduced to contacts within Mexico's Federal Security Directorate, the DFS, a powerful government agency that operated in the shadows. The DFS had the authority to monitor and control organized crime, but many of its members secretly profited from it instead. For a man like El Azul, this connection was invaluable. It opened doors that smugglers could only dream of: protection, information, and access. It was the perfect place for someone who thrived in secrecy. Still, even as he moved closer to the heart of power, he remained grounded. Those who met him in person described him as polite, almost soft-spoken. He preferred modest clothes, clean but simple cars. He avoided alcohol and public arguments. It was this quiet, disciplined demeanor that made him seem almost invisible, a quality that would one day make him legendary. In a world where everyone wanted to be king, he was content to be the shadow behind the throne. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, ambition simmered. The boy from the Sierra had seen enough to understand that survival alone was not enough. To control his destiny, he needed influence, not just among smugglers, but among those who enforced the law. As the decade came to a close, he stood at the edge of transformation. The roads he once traveled to move cattle had become the veins of an empire in the making. The skills he learned as a trader had become the foundation of a criminal strategist. And the quiet boy with watchful eyes had fully become El Azul, the man who would rise through every war, not by shouting, but by whispering. The night air of Sinaloa feels heavy again as another convoy moves through the dark. Headlights flash briefly on dirt roads, then vanish into the hills. Somewhere, El Azul rides in silence, his mind calm, his thoughts years ahead. The first crimes are behind him now, small, calculated, forgotten by most. But the road ahead is long, winding, and filled with storms. He has learned the most important rule of all: in a world built on fear, silence is power. And soon, the world will learn just how powerful silence can be. The year was the mid-1970s, and Mexico was quietly reshaping itself. Skyscrapers rose in Mexico City, oil discoveries promised a new era of prosperity, and the country's ruling class carried the air of control. But beneath the polished surface, a different kind of system was growing, one built on shadows and handshakes, where law and crime intertwined so tightly that no one could tell them apart. It was in this gray space that Juan José Esparragoza Moreno, now known to a few as El Azul, found his next step, joining the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, the DFS, an agency born to protect the nation, but one that would instead teach him how power really worked. The DFS had been created in the 1940s as a secret police force under the Ministry of the Interior. Its purpose was to fight subversion, espionage, and organized crime, but in practice, it became something far murkier, a machine that mixed intelligence work with political repression and corruption. The agents of the DFS were feared across Mexico. They wore suits instead of uniforms, carried pistols beneath their jackets, and spoke in quiet tones that carried the weight of the government itself. To the public, they were ghosts, to the powerful, they were both shield and sword. For a man like El Azul, who prized silence and order, it was the perfect training ground. He entered the agency with the same calm precision that had already defined him. The uniform didn't change who he was, it merely gave him new tools. Inside the DFS, he learned the bureaucratic side of control, paperwork, chains of command, coded language, and, most importantly, access to information. Files crossed his desk containing names, addresses, and movements of everyone from political activists to smugglers. He learned how intelligence could be bought, traded, and weaponized. Knowledge was power, and he was surrounded by it. Many of his colleagues were men like him, young, ambitious, and unafraid to operate in moral grayness. They were paid poorly, yet surrounded by temptation. The DFS was notorious for accepting bribes, turning a blind eye to drug shipments, and even escorting smugglers' convoys under the guise of official duty. It was a world where loyalty was measured not by rank but by discretion. The better you were at keeping secrets, the further you advanced. El Azul excelled. His calm temperament quickly caught the attention of his superiors. Unlike many agents who bragged about their power or used their badge for personal gain, he remained understated. He learned when to speak, when to listen, and when to disappear. Within a few short years, he was trusted with sensitive assignments that required both intelligence and subtlety. His work often took him back to Sinaloa, not as a civilian this time, but as a representative of the federal government. Yet, in those same regions, his old acquaintances from the smuggling world were expanding their reach. Two identities began to blur, the agent and the outlaw. The DFS was deeply entangled with the drug trade by then. Many of its officers were directly involved in protecting the operations of emerging figures like Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero. The agency served as both guardian and participant, ensuring that only approved traffickers could operate, and that the profits flowed upward through the right channels. The Mexican state, in effect, had made a silent pact with the underworld, peace in exchange for control. It was a system of balance, and El Azul was learning how to navigate it perfectly. He witnessed firsthand how influence operated behind closed doors. He saw envelopes passed quietly between businessmen and generals, meetings held in luxurious restaurants where everyone smiled and nothing was written down. The men in those rooms didn't think of themselves as criminals, they were administrators, managing an unspoken economy that fed the nation. For a young man who had grown up in the poverty of Sinaloa, this was an education far beyond anything he could have imagined. He was learning that true power didn't shout. It whispered. At night, when the city settled into silence, he often sat in small cantinas near the government buildings, a glass of mineral water before him while others drank. He would listen to the chatter of other agents, the corruption, the boasting, the dangerous carelessness, and he would file away every word. The DFS was filled with men who believed themselves untouchable. El Azul already knew better. Power, he understood, never lasted for those who flaunted it. His goal was survival, not fame. Gradually, he began to use his position to bridge both worlds. To traffickers, he became a valuable contact inside the government, someone who could provide information, clear shipments, or warn of upcoming raids. To officials, he remained the reliable agent who knew how to manage certain criminal matters discreetly. This dual existence required extraordinary discipline. One wrong move, one careless word, and both sides could turn on him. Yet somehow, he walked the line perfectly, building trust without ever fully belonging to either camp. In those years, Mexico's underworld began to evolve from a scattered network into the foundation of what would become the Guadalajara Cartel. Through the DFS, El Azul was introduced to its architects, Felix Gallardo, Fonseca Carrillo, and Caro Quintero, men who had vision, ambition, and ruthlessness in equal measure. They needed someone who could move between legality and crime with ease, someone who could smooth the friction between government and smugglers. El Azul was that man. His demeanor made him indispensable. While others threatened and shouted, he negotiated. When violence loomed, he sought compromise. He became known as a conciliador, a peacemaker, even within an organization built on violence. The irony was striking. A man trained by a corrupt security agency now served as a diplomat among criminals. But in Mexico's complex web of alliances, it made perfect sense. The DFS and the cartels were mirror images, both driven by money, secrecy, and survival. There were moments of danger, of course. Internal rivalries within the DFS occasionally turned deadly. Some agents disappeared, others were found in shallow graves. Whenever investigations surfaced, El Azul's name was curiously absent. He seemed to glide through every crisis untouched, always one step ahead, as if guided by instinct. Those who worked with him began to speak of his uncanny ability to avoid disaster. It wasn't magic, it was discipline. He never stayed too long in one place, never flaunted wealth, never trusted anyone completely. By the late 1970s, whispers of the DFS's deep corruption had begun to circulate internationally. The United States pressured Mexico to clean house, to crack down on drug operations that were expanding northward. But by then, El Azul had already seen enough to know the agency's fate was sealed. The corruption was too deep, the alliances too dangerous to unwind. So, before the ship began to sink, he quietly began to detach himself, maintaining contacts, gathering allies, preparing for the next evolution of his life. When he finally left the DFS, he did so quietly, without scandal or trace. To outsiders, it seemed as if he had simply moved on, another agent fading into the background. But those who understood the game knew better. He had learned everything he needed, how the system worked, who controlled what, and how to stay alive in a world built on lies. The uniform had been a disguise, the agency, a classroom. Now, El Azul was ready to step fully into the underworld he had once only observed. He carried with him the calmness of a bureaucrat, the precision of an investigator, and the cunning of a survivor. He had seen both sides of power, the official and the illicit, and realized they were not opposites at all, but reflections. As night settled over Mexico City, the skyline glimmered with artificial light, and somewhere in the shadows of the capital, a man folded away his government credentials and stepped into a darker calling. The air outside was cool, heavy with smog and promise. He walked slowly down the narrow street, the echo of his footsteps fading into the hum of the city. The quiet agent was gone, El Azul was now something else entirely, a man who understood that in a world of noise, silence was the strongest weapon of all. By the early 1980s, Mexico's criminal landscape was changing shape, quietly, powerfully, and permanently. The scattered smuggling operations that once dominated Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua were now converging under a single flag, the Guadalajara Cartel. It wasn't born with violence or fanfare, but through whispered meetings, mutual necessity, and government protection. It was an empire built in the shadows, where the old smugglers became lords and politicians became silent partners. And in the midst of this transformation, one man moved carefully among them, not the loudest, not the richest, but perhaps the most respected. El Azul had arrived in Guadalajara. The city itself was deceptive, peaceful on the surface, vibrant with music, commerce, and family life. Yet behind closed doors, it was the nerve center of Mexico's rising drug empire. The cartel's core figures, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero, were already carving up power, forging alliances with Colombian suppliers and distributing routes north into the United States. They controlled not just drugs, but airports, ranches, banks, and entire police units. It was a world that demanded discipline, loyalty, and balance, qualities that made El Azul invaluable. He didn't arrive with ambition to rule, he arrived to survive. He understood that power within the cartel wasn't claimed through blood alone but through utility. A man who could calm tempers, mediate disputes, and maintain peace among egos was worth more than 100 enforcers. And that became his role, the quiet mediator between men of chaos. Felix Gallardo, known as El Padrino, the Godfather, recognized this almost immediately. Gallardo's operation was vast and volatile. His lieutenants were hot-headed, his partners unpredictable, and his alliances fragile. He needed someone who could manage the human side of empire, someone who could sense conflict before it erupted. In El Azul, he found the perfect instrument. Gallardo valued intelligence and restraint, and El Azul embodied both. Within months, El Azul became a trusted figure in meetings that would shape the cartel's future. He rarely spoke first, preferring to listen, observe, and analyze. When he did speak, it was measured, never emotional, always rational. He would say things like, "If you make your move now, you'll win today but lose next year," or, "Peace is cheaper than revenge." In a world addicted to violence, his calm logic stood out. And slowly, even the most violent men began to defer to him when tensions ran high. Through the Guadalajara Cartel, El Azul found himself surrounded by wealth and danger unlike anything he had seen in his days at the DFS. The organization was expanding its operations into cocaine, the real fortune maker, through partnerships with Colombian cartels, particularly the Medellin group led by Pablo Escobar and Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha. Airplanes laden with cocaine were landing in Mexico, refueling, and continuing north into the United States. It was an operation that demanded coordination across thousands of miles, requiring diplomacy, timing, and trust, all qualities El Azul helped maintain. He often handled logistics quietly, ensuring pilots were paid, police were diverted, and bribes were properly distributed. Nothing extravagant, nothing reckless. He operated in a minimalist rhythm, few words, precise actions, no witnesses. While others flaunted mansions and women, he kept a low profile, preferring modest homes, plain cars, and the anonymity of ordinary clothes. Those who didn't know him often mistook him for a chauffeur or a clerk. But those inside the organization understood his importance. His past as a former intelligence agent proved invaluable. He knew how to manage information, what to reveal, what to hide, and how to control perception. If someone was arrested, El Azul knew who to call. If someone went missing, he knew when to stay silent. He became the internal compass of the cartel, a stabilizing force within a world that constantly teetered on chaos. One of his most defining contributions was his ability to mediate disputes. The Guadalajara Cartel wasn't a monolith, it was a collection of powerful men with their own territories, their own ambitions, and their own tempers. Fights over routes, shipments, or money could easily turn bloody. Yet, again and again, El Azul stepped in to cool the fire. He understood human pride, and he knew how to preserve it while enforcing order. Often, his method was simple: private meetings, calm conversation, small concessions. A deal made behind a closed door was always better than a war fought in the open. Those who worked alongside him later described his presence as oddly comforting. In meetings full of shouting, he sat still, eyes sharp, hands folded, voice steady. When he spoke, people listened not out of fear, but because they knew he spoke truthfully. There was something almost monk-like about him, a man detached from vanity, yet deeply attuned to the power of others. And perhaps that was his greatest secret, he never competed for power directly. In a world where everyone wanted to be king, El Azul preferred to be the counselor. He let others take the spotlight, Felix Gallardo, Don Neto, Caro Quintero, while he worked in the background, ensuring the empire stayed intact. This strategy kept him alive while others burned under the weight of their own egos. But even in these years of apparent calm, El Azul knew the balance couldn't last forever. The organization was growing too large, too profitable, and too visible. The Americans were watching, the Colombians were demanding, and within Mexico, political tides were shifting. The DFS, his old home, was disbanded after widespread exposure of its corruption. The safety net between government and crime was thinning. For the first time, he could sense a storm on the horizon. Still, he remained composed. His years inside both systems had taught him one fundamental truth: panic kills faster than bullets. He made sure his operations were clean, his name rarely mentioned, and his trail impossible to follow. If Gallardo represented charisma, and Caro Quintero embodied recklessness, El Azul was the ghost that kept the machine running. In quiet moments, perhaps sitting on the balcony of a small Guadalajara apartment, he would look over the glowing city lights and think of how far he had come. From a farm boy in Sinaloa to an intelligence officer, and now a trusted figure in the most powerful drug cartel in Mexico. Yet, he didn't smile. He knew that every empire, no matter how rich or feared, eventually consumed itself. And deep inside, he was already planning, not just for success, but for survival. When the inevitable collapse would come, and he knew it would, he would not be among the ones scrambling or dying. He would simply step aside, fade into the background, and wait for the dust to settle. Because that was what El Azul did best: survive every storm, one quiet step at a time. By 1984, the Guadalajara Cartel was no longer a secret whispered in smoky rooms. It was an empire stretching across borders, a silent machine that moved tons of cocaine, marijuana, and heroin through Mexico into the United States. The profits were unimaginable, and the power intoxicating. To the men at the top, it felt like the world itself bent to their will. But as the organization grew, so did its exposure. For El Azul, who had built his life on discretion, the noise of success was becoming dangerous. The more they shone, the more they attracted light, and in the shadows, he could already see the figures watching. It started with small tremors. American agents from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, were growing frustrated. Drugs were flowing north in record quantities, yet every time they got close to an operation, the traffickers seemed to vanish in advance. Someone, somewhere, was protecting them. That someone, of course, was the Mexican government, deeply intertwined with the Guadalajara Cartel's network. But to the Americans, it was a humiliation, and it couldn't continue. Among those agents was Enrique Kiki Camarena, a U.S. agent stationed in Guadalajara. Young, disciplined, and relentless, he had begun to piece together the scale of the cartel's operations. He infiltrated their networks, gathered names, traced shipments, and slowly, his work began to shake the cartel's illusion of invisibility. To men like El Azul, Camarena was a threat, not because of his aggression, but because of his patience. He was quiet, methodical, and unafraid. A mirror, in many ways, of El Azul himself, but on the other side of the war. Inside the cartel, paranoia began to creep in. Meetings grew more secretive, voices lower, tempers shorter. Felix Gallardo, once composed, was now increasingly concerned with betrayal. Caro Quintero, impulsive and proud, became reckless. He had recently fallen in love with a young woman, Sarah Cosio, the niece of a powerful Mexican politician, a relationship that drew unwanted attention. And while the organization had long enjoyed government protection, whispers from Mexico City suggested that pressure from the U.S. was forcing some officials to distance themselves. The shield that had kept them untouchable was beginning to crack. El Azul sensed it all. He had seen this kind of unraveling before, when men confused power for immunity, and when ego outgrew reason. He tried, in his quiet way, to steady the storm. He urged calm, caution, and discipline. He reminded the others that visibility was their greatest enemy. But few were listening. Money was pouring in faster than ever, and with it came arrogance. Mansions grew larger, cars flashier, parties louder. The empire was celebrating its own success, blind to the fact that every toast was a countdown. Then came the breaking point. In early 1985, Agent Camarena disappeared. He had been kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, an act so brutal it would forever change the course of Mexico's criminal world. The operation had been carried out by cartel figures, including men close to Caro Quintero and Fonseca Carrillo. The details were horrific, but what mattered most was the consequence: the United States was furious. The protection that had once shielded the Guadalajara Cartel vanished overnight. Washington demanded justice. The DEA flooded Mexico with investigators. The Mexican government, under pressure, turned on its own partners. The once invincible cartel began to fracture under the weight of fear. Raids swept through Guadalajara and Sinaloa. Ranches were seized, properties confiscated, and dozens of men disappeared. Caro Quintero fled to Costa Rica, only to be captured. Fonseca Carrillo was arrested shortly after, dragged through the streets by police. The empire that had taken a decade to build was collapsing in weeks. And in the middle of the chaos, El Azul did what he always did best: he disappeared. Those who knew him later said he had seen it coming long before. He had quietly begun moving his operations, his contacts, and his assets out of Guadalajara months before the storm hit. When others scrambled, he simply stepped into the shadows. There were no newspaper photos of his arrest, no headlines with his name. While the DEA hunted Gallardo's inner circle, El Azul's name never even appeared on the radar. It was as if he had never existed. Behind the scenes, though, he was busy. Using his old government contacts and his deep understanding of how power shifted, he began to rebuild, not as a boss, but as a broker. He offered safe passage, introductions, and peace deals between surviving factions. The DEA's crackdown had splintered the cartel into regional groups, what would eventually become the Sinaloa Cartel, the Tijuana Cartel, and the Juarez Cartel. While the others fought for control, El Azul positioned himself as a neutral party, the man who could talk to everyone and make deals no one else could. He had no soldiers, no flashy operations, but he had something far more valuable: credibility. Everyone trusted him because he had never betrayed anyone. He didn't play both sides for personal gain, he maintained balance. In a world of lies and chaos, that made him indispensable. Meanwhile, Felix Gallardo was captured in 1989. The godfather of Guadalajara, once untouchable, was led away in handcuffs. It marked the true end of an era, the moment when the drug trade fragmented into smaller, more violent organizations. Yet even as the original cartel fell apart, El Azul endured. His name never appeared in official reports. His properties were never raided. To the authorities, he was invisible; to the underworld, he was irreplaceable. There's an almost poetic image of him during this period, sitting alone in a modest house somewhere in Sinaloa, the television flickering with news of arrests, his expression calm, untroubled. He knew the world was changing, and he was already thinking about the next one. While others mourned their lost empires, El Azul saw opportunity in the chaos. New alliances could be made. New routes could be drawn. New leaders would rise, men who would need someone they could trust. In the years that followed, the myth of El Azul began to grow quietly among the surviving traffickers. They called him, the man who survived every war, and not without reason. While the DEA celebrated arrests and the media declared victory, he was already laying the foundation for the next generation of cartels. He never sought revenge, never chased fame, never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The Guadalajara Cartel had fallen, but its ghost lingered in every corner of Mexico's criminal world, in the alliances, the routes, the politics, the unspoken rules. And among those ghosts, El Azul moved like smoke, seen by some, remembered by few, understood by almost no one. He had witnessed the rise and fall of giants and walked away untouched. The world was entering a new phase of violence, and for a man like him, that meant one thing: survival through silence. In that silence, he began to chart his next chapter, a chapter that would take him deeper into the heart of the Mexican drug war, but always from the edges, never the center. He would serve new bosses, outlast new wars, and watch history repeat itself, all from behind the same calm, unreadable eyes that had watched Guadalajara burn. The fall of the Guadalajara Cartel in the mid to late 1980s was supposed to mark the end of an era, the dismantling of a criminal empire so vast that it had seemed untouchable. But in truth, it was only a transformation, a shedding of skin. The route still existed, the money still flowed, and the demand north of the border was stronger than ever. All that changed were the names, the faces, and the loyalties. Out of the ashes of Guadalajara, new cartels began to take shape: the Sinaloa Cartel, the Tijuana Cartel, and the Juarez Cartel, each fighting for control of the empire's remains. And in the quiet spaces between them, like a shadow moving between flickering flames, was El Azul. For most men, the collapse of their organization meant exile or death. For El Azul, it meant evolution. He had no army to protect, no territory to defend, no grand ego demanding recognition. This made him perfectly suited for the new landscape, a landscape defined not by stability, but by fluid alliances, betrayals, and constant reinvention. He re-emerged first in Juarez, the sprawling border city where money, drugs, and desperation collided every night. There, the remnants of the Guadalajara network were reorganizing under Amado Carrillo Fuentes, a young, charismatic trafficker who would soon earn the nickname El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies. Amado was unlike most of his contemporaries. He preferred strategy over spectacle, negotiation over bloodshed, and wealth over chaos. It was this pragmatism that drew El Azul to him, two quiet minds recognizing each other in a storm of noise. The two men began working together in the late 1980s, just as the cocaine trade was reaching unprecedented heights. The Colombians, pressured by U.S. crackdowns, were relying more heavily on Mexican traffickers to move their product. Mexico was no longer just a bridge, it was becoming a partner. The cartels, now independent and regionalized, were taking control of distribution, logistics, and smuggling operations into the United States. This shift demanded coordination, diplomacy, and trust, the exact qualities El Azul offered. Amado Carrillo, ambitious and forward-thinking, was expanding rapidly. His plan was simple but revolutionary: to use an entire fleet of airplanes to move cocaine through Mexico, allowing faster, safer deliveries than ever before. To manage such an operation required intelligence and an intricate web of contacts: government officials, air traffic controllers, and border agents. El Azul, with his background in both law enforcement and the old Guadalajara network, became one of his key advisors. Those close to Amado often described the partnership as one of quiet understanding. El Azul was not there to command but to counsel. He offered structure, order, and the wisdom of experience. When rival factions in Juarez began to argue or when an official demanded too much, it was El Azul who stepped in to mediate. His ability to diffuse tension without ever raising his voice became legendary. To the young men who surrounded Amado, he was almost mythic, a man who could calm killers with a few words and make million-dollar deals feel as simple as casual agreements. As the Juarez cartel grew in power, Amado began to dominate Mexico's drug trade. His wealth rivaled that of legitimate businessmen, his influence extended from Colombia to Chicago. Yet through it all, El Azul remained in the background, avoiding photographs, avoiding public recognition, content to be the invisible architect behind the success. He often traveled quietly between Juarez, Culiacán, and Mexico City, carrying no bodyguards, using false identities when needed. He met with traffickers, officials, and intermediaries, always maintaining his calm demeanor. He didn't drink, didn't boast, didn't indulge in excess. To those who met him, he seemed less like a criminal and more like a disciplined diplomat. He never spoke of violence, but when violence became inevitable, he made sure it was controlled, swift, quiet, and without spectacle. It was during these years that his reputation as the quiet narco truly solidified. Journalists would later describe him as a ghost who could pass through wars untouched, a man whose presence could be felt but rarely seen. Within the cartel, his influence was undeniable, yet no one could define his role precisely. Some said he handled logistics, others said he managed government relations. The truth was simpler: El Azul was the glue that held the network together. Still, the peace could not last forever. By the mid-1990s, Mexico's cartels had become so powerful that the balance of power began to strain. The Sinaloa Cartel, led by Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, Héctor El Güero Palma, and later Ismael El Mayo Zambada, was rising fast. They were bolder, younger, more willing to embrace chaos. Their operations in the Pacific were threatening Juárez's dominance. Rivalries between regions were turning into full-scale wars. As tensions flared, El Azul once again played the role of mediator. He understood that open war was bad for business, bad for everyone. He worked tirelessly to broker truces between Amato's faction in Juárez and the up-and-coming Sinaloa network. He convened secret meetings in ranches and safe houses, trying to convince both sides that cooperation was more profitable than bloodshed. There's a story, half rumor, half legend, of one such meeting somewhere near Durango. The room was filled with some of the most dangerous men in Mexico, their hands never far from their guns. Voices were raised, accusations thrown. Then, El Azul spoke. His words, calm and deliberate, cut through the tension. He reminded them that they were businessmen, not soldiers, that money flowed only when the streets were quiet. When he finished, the room fell silent. The men put their guns away. The truce held, at least for a while. But the inevitable could not be delayed forever. In 1997, Amado Carrillo Fuentes died mysteriously during a botched plastic surgery operation in Mexico City. His death sent shockwaves through the underworld. The Juárez cartel, without its visionary leader, began to splinter. Internal rivalries erupted, and government pressure mounted. Once again, El Azul slipped away. He did not fight for control, nor did he attempt to rebuild what was lost. Instead, he quietly moved back toward Sinaloa, not to rejoin the old bosses, but to help build a new order. The world was changing again, and he would, as always, adapt. It was around this time that whispers began to spread among traffickers, that El Azul had become something like a conciliador mayor, a great mediator, someone who could sit at any table and bring peace among warring factions. Whether in Juárez, Tijuana, or Sinaloa, his name carried the same weight, respect. He had no need for violence to command fear. His weapon was patience. His armor was anonymity. And his only true loyalty was to survival. As he left Juárez behind, flying low across the desert under a false name, perhaps he allowed himself a quiet thought, that the empires of blood and gold would rise and fall forever, but only the man who knew when to vanish, the man who understood silence, would truly endure. And in that truth lay the secret of El Azul's extraordinary life. While others sought power, he sought permanence. When El Azul returned to Sinaloa in the late 1990s, the air carried the heaviness of transition, a silence before another storm. The fall of Amado Carrillo Fuentes had left a power vacuum that rippled across Mexico's underworld. Old alliances were cracking, new factions were forming, and the government was shifting its stance under U.S. pressure to fight the so-called war on drugs. For a man who had already survived multiple eras, from the DFS to Guadalajara, from Juarez to the fall of giants, this was familiar ground. He knew that when the dust of chaos settled, there would always be space for a man like him. Sinaloa itself was changing. The mountains that once hid small-time growers and smugglers were now home to the world's most powerful trafficking network, the Sinaloa Cartel, led by a trio whose names would become infamous: Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and Hector El Güero Palma. They were younger than El Azul, but far more visible, bold, daring, and addicted to expansion. Their methods were different, more aggressive, less diplomatic. They embraced modern logistics, technology, and violence with equal enthusiasm. Yet beneath all their ambition, they still needed something that only a few men in Mexico could offer: stability. And that was El Azul's gift. When he first reappeared within Sinaloa's circles, it was not as a conqueror or rival. He came as an advisor, a man of calm presence and long memory. He had known the fathers and uncles of many of the new generation. To them, he was both a living legend and a reminder of an older code, one where silence and restraint mattered as much as firepower. His reputation preceded him, the man who survived every war, who could talk to anyone, who could make peace where bullets had failed. It didn't take long for El Mayo Zambada to take notice. Zambada, who had a similar love for discretion, was one of the few modern capos who truly valued diplomacy over spectacle. Unlike El Chapo, who thrived on chaos and expansion, El Mayo preferred balance, a philosophy that mirrored El Azul's own. The two men met quietly, perhaps in the green hills of Badiraguado or in some safe house on the outskirts of Culiacan, where the air smelled of rain and fear. Their meeting, by all accounts, was not one of negotiation but of recognition, two quiet strategists who understood the value of patience in a world gone mad. From that point on, El Azul became a key figure in what would later be known as the Sinaloa Federation, not as a commander but as a bridge between its various factions. He had relationships not just in Sinaloa but across Mexico, Juarez, Tijuana, and even remnants of the Gulf and Beltran-Leyva organizations. His ability to move between them without hostility made him invaluable. He was the only man who could pick up the phone and call both sides of a war, and both would answer. It was during this time that El Azul began to reshape his role entirely. He no longer dealt directly in shipments or money. Instead, he became a negotiator of peace, a facilitator who maintained communication lines between rival organizations, reducing violence where possible, coordinating truces, and ensuring business continued even amidst chaos. In an underworld consumed by greed and vengeance, his logic was simple: wars attract attention, peace makes money. There's a quiet story told among old traffickers about a night in the early 2000s when the Sinaloa Cartel and the Tijuana Cartel were on the brink of open war. Dozens of men were dead, and retaliation loomed. The government was preparing for a bloodbath. Then, somewhere between Culiacan and Mexicali, El Azul arranged a secret meeting, not between the bosses, but between their most trusted lieutenants. He arrived alone, without guards, carrying nothing but a folder of notes and a rosary in his pocket. The meeting lasted hours. Voices were raised, fists slammed, but he never lost his composure. At dawn, when he stood to leave, the men who had sworn to kill each other shook hands instead. The truce held for months. He never bragged about it. In fact, most of the time, his involvement in such moments was never mentioned at all. His power lay precisely in that invisibility. To the government, he was a name rarely mentioned in reports. To his allies, he was the man who made things work. And to his enemies, if he had any, he was simply unreachable. But as peace returned to certain territories, another force began to rise: Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. El Chapo, brash and ambitious, had escaped from prison in 2001 and was determined to reclaim his throne. His rise brought both power and instability. He expanded rapidly, pushing into territories controlled by other cartels, particularly the Juarez and Gulf organizations. Violence flared again across Mexico, and the fragile peace that El Azul had worked to maintain began to strain under El Chapo's hunger for dominance. Still, El Azul did not oppose him outright. Instead, he adapted, serving as a counterbalance within the Sinaloa structure. He became one of the triumvirate, the informal leadership composed of El Chapo, El Mayo, and himself. While El Chapo built empires and escaped headlines, and El Mayo maintained logistics and political ties, El Azul served as the voice of reason. He handled internal disputes, mediated alliances, and kept the organization cohesive even as its power exploded across continents. Those close to him said he spoke often about the dangers of pride. Visibility, he once warned, is the beginning of the end. He would point to the fates of men like Amado Carrillo, Felix Gallardo, and Caro Quintero, men undone not by their enemies but by their own fame. To him, survival wasn't about winning wars, it was about avoiding them altogether. He continued to live modestly, preferring plain houses and small gatherings. He avoided luxury cars, traveled without entourage, and used false identities. Even as his influence expanded, he appeared to the outside world as just another aging man in a quiet neighborhood. In a profession defined by paranoia, this humility was his greatest disguise. By the mid-2000s, El Azul had quietly become one of the most respected, and least understood, figures in the Mexican drug trade. Younger traffickers saw him as almost mythic, an elder statesman whose word carried more weight than threats. Law enforcement knew his name but could rarely prove his existence. Journalists could find almost no photographs of him. He was everywhere and nowhere, the shadow behind the cartel's uneasy peace. As Mexico plunged deeper into violence under President Felipe Calderón's military offensive against organized crime, El Azul's approach seemed almost archaic, diplomacy in a time of chaos. But he never wavered. When the government toppled one boss, he reached out to the survivors, maintaining channels of communication. When rival groups turned on each other, he arranged backdoor truces that allowed trade to continue. He was the keeper of continuity, the man who ensured that, no matter how much blood was spilled, the business itself never died. And through it all, his calm never broke. Those who spoke with him described his voice as slow, deliberate, almost meditative. He had long stopped believing in loyalty or friendship. To him, everything was temporary, power, money, even trust. The only thing that mattered was balance. And balance required silence. In the world of chaos that was becoming Mexico's drug war, El Azul was the last of a dying breed, a man who believed that order, even among criminals, was still possible. As the 21st century unfolded, that belief would be tested like never before. For now, though, in those early years of his return to Sinaloa, he had found a strange kind of peace, not the peace of safety, but the peace of understanding. He knew who he was, what he could control, and what he could never change. And so, as the night settled over the mountains of Culiacán, a quiet man in his 60s sat in the dim light of a small room, the hum of distant engines in the background, his hands folded, his eyes calm. The world around him was burning once again, but for El Azul, it was just another storm. He had weathered them all before, and, as always, he intended to survive this one too. By the time the mid-2000s arrived, Mexico was standing on the edge of a knife. The cartels that had once operated under unspoken rules, respect, secrecy, and hierarchy, were now breaking apart into factions driven by greed, vengeance, and fear. The government's new war on organized crime, led by President Felipe Calderón, brought soldiers into the streets, helicopters into the skies, and chaos into the towns that had once lived in uneasy peace. For many, it felt like the end of an era. But for El Azul, it was just another transition, another reshuffling of the deck in a game he had been playing for decades. Inside the Sinaloa cartel, the pressure was building. What had once been a well-balanced structure of shared power was now beginning to fracture. El Chapo's ambition had outgrown diplomacy, his empire was expanding too fast, too loud, and too violently. His battles against the Beltran-Leyva brothers, who had once been Sinaloa allies, ignited a blood war that painted entire cities in fear. Suddenly, friends became enemies, and former allies became targets. Trust, already rare, evaporated completely. In this atmosphere of betrayal, El Azul's calm presence became both invaluable and impossible to maintain. He had spent years building bridges between men who now sought to burn them down. The Beltran-Leyvas, Arturo, Alfredo, and Hector, had long worked within Sinaloa's framework, managing routes, logistics, and intelligence. But after Alfredo's arrest in 2008, they blamed El Chapo for setting them up. Their revenge was swift, brutal, and public. Bodies hung from bridges, messages carved into walls, and the streets of Culiacan echoed with gunfire. Through it all, El Azul tried to steady the ship. He reached out quietly to both sides, urging restraint, offering compromise. But it was like speaking reason to a storm. The new generation of narcos was not guided by patience or logic, they were guided by pride, pain, and a hunger for dominance. To them, El Azul's old ways, peace, balance, negotiation, seemed outdated, even weak. Still, he persisted. Behind the scenes, he orchestrated small truces in key territories, trying to limit the bloodshed. In places like Durango, Sonora, and Baja California, his influence managed to hold back the flood for a time. But he could see the tide turning. The Mexican underworld he had once helped stabilize was now spiraling into fragmentation. Dozens of splinter groups were forming, each claiming a piece of the empire that once ran under a single flag. And as the government intensified its crackdown, the pressure from above grew as deadly as the wars below. Raids, arrests, and assassinations became daily occurrences. Generals replaced governors. Entire police forces were disbanded or corrupted. Every day brought new betrayals, new disappearances. The walls were closing in, and even the most careful players were no longer safe. Yet somehow, El Azul continued to move, silently, invisibly, through the chaos. Intelligence reports from this period describe him as a ghost figure, a man whose presence was felt but never confirmed. While other leaders were caught or killed, he remained untouched. Law enforcement would raid a safe house and find traces, a half-empty cup of coffee, a freshly smoked cigarette, a neatly folded newspaper, but never the man himself. It was as if he could see the future, anticipating every move before it happened. This gift, or instinct, came from experience. He understood that survival in this new era wasn't about control, it was about invisibility. The government was now working hand in hand with American agencies, DEA, CIA, Homeland Security. Satellites tracked phones, drones scanned jungles, and informants traded secrets for freedom. To live, he had to disappear completely. So he began to fade, little by little. He stopped attending meetings, stopped using phones, stopped traveling openly. He relied only on a handful of trusted messengers, most of them older men who owed him their lives. His instructions were passed in handwritten notes, delivered through coded signals or dead drops, a return to old-school espionage methods learned during his days in the DFS. But even in retreat, he wasn't idle. His hand could still be seen in the patterns of cartel diplomacy. When the Zetas split from the Gulf Cartel and unleashed their campaign of terror across northern Mexico, El Azul was one of the few who reached out to all sides, advocating for limited warfare and defined boundaries. To him, chaos was bad for business, and chaos was exactly what the Zetas represented. He saw their brutality, the public beheadings, mass killings, and kidnappings, as a cancer that would destroy the old order entirely. He wasn't wrong. Those who knew him during this time said he seemed almost philosophical about it all. Every generation, he once said to a confidant, forgets that silence is stronger than noise. They want to be famous. Fame is death. He spent his days reading newspapers, studying government reports, and staying one step ahead of everyone, the police, the military, and even his own supposed allies. In 2008 and 2009, when the Beltranleyva organization declared open war on El Chapo and the Sinaloa faction, El Azul again attempted to broker peace. There were meetings, quiet, secret, tense, in ranches outside of Mazatlan and villas near Tepic. The talks rarely lasted. The new leaders were too consumed by pride. But even as they rejected his counsel, they respected his presence. No one dared touch him. He was considered sacred ground, untouchable, neutral, wise. Still, the wars took their toll. Entire regions descended into bloodshed. Thousands died, and Mexico changed forever. It was no longer the Mexico El Azul had known in the 1980s or 1990s, when corruption was controlled, when violence was measured, when the rules were at least understood. Now, there were no rules left. Just endless vengeance. As the decade ended, his position in the underworld became increasingly paradoxical. He was both central and invisible, a figure whose name carried weight, yet whose location, motives, and actions were pure mystery. Some believed he had retired entirely, living quietly in a small village under another identity. Others said he remained active, managing peace talks from the shadows, ensuring that what little order remained didn't collapse completely. It was during this time that whispers of his spirituality began to surface. Some said he had grown deeply religious, spending hours in prayer. Others believed he had simply become a philosopher of survival, detached, analytical, aware that his life's work was less about power and more about endurance. In many ways, the chaos around him became a reflection of what he had always feared, that the new generation would destroy everything with their arrogance. And yet, through it all, El Azul never seemed angry. Only resigned. He had seen too many wars to expect peace to last forever. But what few realized was that even as he aged, even as others died or vanished, El Azul was quietly preparing for another transformation, his final act of survival. He knew that when the time came, he would do what he had always done best, disappear without a trace, leaving behind only questions, legends, and silence. For now, though, the underworld still felt his invisible hand. When violence cooled unexpectedly, when rival factions paused for breath, when chaos seemed momentarily organized, somewhere in the distance, El Azul was still there, pulling strings softly, calmly, unseen. By 2010, the world around El Azul had completely transformed. The old cartels that once operated like secret corporations had splintered into smaller, deadlier factions. Mexico was engulfed in a new kind of war, not just between criminals and the government, but between chaos and order itself. Streets once ruled by whispers were now ruled by screams. Headlines spoke of massacres, disappearances, and entire towns caught in the crossfire. For the first time, even the most loyal insiders began to wonder if there was still room for men like him, men of patience, silence, and strategy. But El Azul was not like the others. He had seen too many empires fall to believe in permanence. To him, survival was not about fighting harder, it was about staying invisible while others destroyed themselves. And so, in the early years of the new decade, as El Chapo waged his war of expansion and the Mexican government escalated its offensives, El Azul quietly began to withdraw from the front lines of the underworld, not in defeat, but in design. It was around this time that rumors began circulating of an internal council, an informal meeting of minds, within the Sinaloa Cartel. El Chapo Guzman, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and Juan José El Azul Esparragoza Moreno were said to be the three pillars keeping the organization from imploding. Each man brought a different strength. El Chapo was the bold strategist, El Mayo the logistical mastermind, and El Azul the voice of reason, the diplomat who kept their empire from consuming itself. The idea of a triad running one of the most powerful criminal syndicates in history was almost mythical, yet it made perfect sense. For every empire to survive, it needed balance. El Chapo's daring nature often attracted heat, both from the government and rival cartels. El Mayo's cautious style kept operations efficient but could make decisions slow. El Azul existed between them, bridging fire and calm, chaos and order. He was the whisper that prevented wars, the one who negotiated truces, and the one who reminded them that no matter how high they climbed, visibility was death. It was said that El Azul often urged them to minimize violence, to avoid unnecessary confrontations with the military. "The blood brings cameras," he would say. "And the cameras bring the Americans." He had watched this cycle play out countless times. The louder the cartels became, the more foreign attention they attracted, and the more fragile their empires grew. But El Chapo's fame was rising faster than anyone could contain. His escapes, his tunnels, his luxury, they all made him a folk hero and a liability at once. Behind the scenes, El Azul continued to do what he had always done best, build quiet networks of understanding. He maintained contact with intermediaries, corrupt officials, and former intelligence operatives who still owed him favors. Some of these connections stretched back decades, remnants of his time with the DFS. These relationships were his true shield, invisible, loyal, and deeply rooted in the culture of mutual survival. He didn't need to buy protection, he had cultivated it through trust and time. He also maintained an unusual degree of respect from the authorities themselves. Even among law enforcement, El Azul was seen as the gentleman of the drug trade, a man who avoided violence, never targeted civilians, and handled disputes diplomatically. Unlike other bosses who glorified brutality, he preferred peace, efficiency, and control. There were even stories of him ordering medical care for wounded rivals or ensuring that families of slain men were compensated. Such gestures were rare in a world built on revenge, and they reinforced his reputation as the calm center in a storm of blood. As the wars between cartels intensified, especially with the rise of Los Zetas and the expansion of the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generation, CJNG, El Azul watched with detached caution. He saw in CJNG the same hunger and recklessness that had once fueled younger men like El Chapo, and he understood where that path led. Yet he didn't interfere directly. His philosophy had evolved. He was no longer a player on the board but the quiet observer who understood every move before it was made. There were still whispers of his influence. Some said he had played a role in preventing an all-out war between Sinaloa and the Gulf Cartel around 2011. Others claimed he negotiated with remnants of the Juarez cartel to divide territory peacefully. A few believed he even communicated indirectly with government intermediaries, men who preferred stability over chaos. None of these claims were ever confirmed, but they fit his pattern. Wherever balance was restored, El Azul's presence could usually be felt. In his personal life, he had become almost a ghost. He rarely stayed in one place longer than a few weeks. His family, though never fully visible, was said to be under constant protection, moving between properties under false names. He avoided contact with his children, not out of neglect, but out of love. He knew that proximity was danger. His way of protecting them was distance. Those few who met him during this time described him as calm, quiet, and aged but still alert, a man who could sit in silence for an hour before saying something that changed the direction of an entire conversation. His demeanor carried the weight of decades of observation. He no longer sought money or power, those were illusions that only led men to ruin. What he valued now was continuity, the ability to maintain order, however temporary, in a world addicted to chaos. By 2012, the government began releasing lists of Mexico's most wanted men. El Chapo Guzman topped every list. El Mayo Zambada followed closely behind. But El Azul. His name appeared near the bottom, sometimes not at all. It was as though he didn't exist. No photographs, no recordings, no sightings. Some officers even questioned whether he was still alive. But in the quiet alleys of Sinaloa, among those who truly knew the underworld, they would whisper, El Azul never dies. He waits. And indeed, waiting was what he did best. While others fought, he observed. While others boasted, he planned. He had lived long enough to know that the surest path to survival was not through dominance, but through disappearance. As Mexico entered another chapter of violence and confusion, El Azul began to vanish once more, not suddenly, but gradually, like mist retreating into the mountains. He reduced his appearances, cut off communication channels, and began handing quiet responsibilities to younger operatives who had earned his trust. He trained them not in violence, but in restraint. Don't let them know your name, he would say. The less they know, the longer you live. To outsiders, it might have looked like retirement. But those who understood him knew better. El Azul was never driven by power, he was driven by preservation. Every retreat was a strategic move. Every silence was a decision. In the twilight of his career, he had become something more than a criminal, he was a myth. The police files said he was over 70, possibly in declining health. The streets whispered he still controlled the Sinaloa cartel's peace behind the scenes. Journalists speculated that he had already passed away and that his legend was now being used as a ghost to frighten rivals into compliance. Yet, if one were to imagine him during those years, sitting in a dimly lit house somewhere in the Sierra Madre, the sound of distant crickets in the night, sipping black coffee as he read the news of another raid or another death, one could almost sense a faint smile. Not of joy, but of understanding. He had seen everything: empires rise, friends fall, alliances burn, and governments collapse. He had survived every era, every betrayal, every so-called end. And he knew, perhaps better than anyone, that as long as men sought power, there would always be a place for the quiet ones, the ones who understood that in the end, the loudest man in the room is always the first to die. By 2013, whispers of El Azul's presence began to fade into myth. The name still circulated among those who understood the deeper layers of Mexico's criminal underworld, but sightings had become nearly non-existent. Government reports grew uncertain, journalists speculated wildly, and the newer generation of traffickers spoke of him not as a man, but as a legend. He had entered that rare category reserved for the untouchable, the kind of figure who became more powerful in absence than in presence. And yet, the reality was simpler and far more human. Juan José Esparragoza Moreno was aging. The years of calculated calm had left their mark. His once sharp eyes had grown slower, his movements more deliberate. But his mind, as those who still communicated with him would later recall, remained crystal clear. He could still read the shifting lines of power like a chess master who knew every move before it was made. At this time, the Sinaloa Federation was reaching the peak of its power. El Chapo Guzmán had rebuilt his empire after his 2001 escape from prison, turning the organization into a global network stretching across 5 continents. He was moving tons of cocaine and methamphetamine across borders, laundering billions through businesses, and wielding influence that reached into politics, law enforcement, and media. Yet, with power came instability. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow it cast, and El Azul could see those shadows gathering again. He was never one for the spotlight, and El Chapo's growing fame worried him deeply. The man who once preached invisibility was now watching his partner become a worldwide sensation. The Rolling Stone interview, the lavish tunnels, the songs, the myth of the Robin Hood of Sinaloa, all of it was noise, and noise attracted death. El Azul tried, as always, to counsel caution. When they know your face, he once said, they no longer fear your silence. Behind closed doors, he advocated for restraint. He believed the cartel should divide its operations, lower its profile, and quietly secure its financial base rather than chase headlines. El Mayo Zambada shared this philosophy, preferring the shadows to the limelight, but El Chapo's ego was too far gone. He had become both the heart and the vulnerability of their empire. During this time, El Azul's own operations, or what remained of them, focused almost entirely on mediation and organization. He served as the invisible thread connecting the various wings of the cartel. When disagreements erupted between lieutenants, when shipments were lost, or when alliances broke, it was often El Azul's word that restored order. He had no army, no overt show of force, yet his name still carried weight strong enough to halt bloodshed. It was also during these years that rumors of his semi-retirement began to spread. Some said he had moved deep into the mountains, living a quiet life surrounded by a small circle of loyal men. Others whispered that he was living in Jalisco under an assumed identity, managing legitimate businesses through intermediaries. There were even tales of him walking freely through towns under government control, protected by mutual respect rather than fear. But none of it could ever be confirmed. Then, in 2014, came the event that reshaped everything. El Chapo Guzman was captured. The Mexican Navy, working with U.S. agencies, surrounded a small apartment in Mazatlan and arrested the world's most famous fugitive without a single shot fired. The operation made international headlines. Cameras flashed, politicians smiled, and the world celebrated the capture of the so-called most powerful drug lord on earth. But within the shadows of that same celebration, El Azul understood something very different, that an empire had just lost its most unpredictable pillar. He was neither surprised nor shaken. In truth, he had predicted this outcome long before it happened. He knew that El Chapo's fame had made him a target not just for governments, but for rivals and traitors alike. And now, with one of the triad gone, the balance within the Sinaloa cartel shifted dangerously. Immediately, the vultures began circling. Factions loyal to El Chapo, those loyal to El Mayo, and independent commanders all maneuvered for control. The government thought the capture would bring stability. Instead, it triggered chaos. In the vacuum of leadership, El Azul once again stepped forward, quietly, carefully, to hold the structure together. He coordinated through intermediaries, calling for calm and reminding the different groups that war would destroy them all. His message was consistent: stability first, revenge later. Through quiet meetings and coded communication, he convinced several factions to keep the organization united. For a time, it worked. But there was a growing sense, even among his closest contacts, that El Azul was getting tired. Not weak, not careless, just weary. He had spent over 40 years surviving wars that never truly ended, mediating between men who never learned, and preserving empires that always crumbled under their own weight. He once described it, in a rare moment of reflection, as a circle of smoke. You can see it, you can shape it, but you can never hold it. In early 2014, reports began to emerge suggesting that El Azul had been involved in delicate peace talks between rival groups in Sinaloa and Durango. It was said that he sought to prevent open warfare after El Chapo's arrest. Government sources later confirmed that intelligence showed communication between his network and various cartel factions. But then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished again. Then, in June 2014, Mexican media outlets began reporting something extraordinary: El Azul was dead. According to initial reports, he had been involved in a fatal car accident near Sinaloa. The story claimed that his family had quietly retrieved his body, held a small funeral, and buried him without attracting attention. There were no official statements, no photographs, no confirmations from authorities. It was as though he had died exactly as he had lived, quietly, invisibly, leaving behind only uncertainty. The government refused to confirm the story. The U.S. DEA remained skeptical, stating that there was no reliable evidence of his death. Journalists tried to find a supposed crash site but came up empty. Witnesses contradicted each other. Some claimed to have attended a small wake, others swore he was still alive, living under another identity. For months, the rumor dominated headlines: had El Azul really died? To many who had known him, the question itself was meaningless. Whether he was alive or dead didn't matter. What mattered was that he had once again achieved the impossible: he had vanished completely. Those who believed in his death said it was fitting, a quiet, accidental end for a man who had spent his life avoiding spectacle. Those who doubted it said it was just another move in his long game, another layer of invisibility. They pointed out that no photos existed of his body, no official report had ever been published, and his family remained silent. In the absence of proof, El Azul became something more than human. He became a ghost story, a cautionary legend whispered in Sinaloa's bars and mountains. To young traffickers, he was a symbol of intelligence and restraint; to old ones, he was the last of the gentlemen, a man who knew that survival was not about dominance, but discretion. And somewhere in that uncertainty lay his greatest victory. Whether buried under Sinaloa soil or living under another name in some distant village, El Azul had done what no one else ever managed in that world: he had left on his own terms. Not captured, not killed, not betrayed. Simply gone. In the end, the question of his death was irrelevant. What mattered was that his silence had outlasted every scream. In the months following the rumors of El Azul's death, Mexico's criminal landscape shifted like sand beneath a restless tide. His name faded from the daily whispers of the underworld, replaced by new faces, louder wars, and the ever-present chaos of the drug trade. Yet, for those who truly understood the structure of power that bound the cartels together, his absence was not a void, it was a silence that spoke louder than any gunfire. Because in that silence, people began to wonder, was El Azul truly gone? Or had he simply chosen, once again, to disappear into the folds of the world he had mastered so completely? To understand the legend that grew after 2014, one must remember the peculiar aura surrounding his name. Unlike El Chapo, whose legend was fueled by tunnels and escapes, or El Mayo, whose myth was built on longevity and control, El Azul's reputation came from something far rarer: invisibility. He had lived through decades of chaos and yet had almost no photographs, no public appearances, no traceable assets. His entire existence seemed crafted from shadows, and in those shadows, the line between truth and myth dissolved. When the alleged car accident made headlines, many in Sinaloa refused to believe it. Old friends and former associates spoke quietly, careful not to reveal too much, but their eyes betrayed doubt. If anyone could fake his death, one of them supposedly said, it would be Azul. Others hinted that the car crash was a story designed to protect him, a smokescreen to allow him to retire without being hunted. After all, how could anyone pursue a ghost? Even the authorities seemed uncertain. The Mexican Attorney General's office initially said they were investigating the reports but later retracted the statement, admitting that no body had been recovered. The DEA, which had pursued El Azul for years, released a brief comment noting that they had received unconfirmed reports of his death but considered him possibly still alive. It was the perfect ending for a man who had built a life around ambiguity. But while the world speculated, the Sinaloa Federation was entering a new and perilous era. El Chapo was back in prison, and the organization was fracturing under the weight of its own ambitions. Rival cartels sensed weakness. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, was rising fast, brutal and fearless, led by Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho. The balance that El Azul had once maintained through quiet diplomacy was gone. His subtle influence, his calm mediation, his philosophy of avoiding unnecessary wars, all of it vanished with him. The years that followed were marked by unprecedented bloodshed. Between 2014 and 2018, Mexico saw some of its most violent internal conflicts between cartels. The old ways, deals sealed by handshakes, negotiations carried out in secret, were being replaced by open warfare, social media threats, and a new generation of traffickers who valued fame more than longevity. It was a world El Azul would never have thrived in. His quiet strategy belonged to another time, a time when discretion was the greatest weapon. Still, there were strange reports, scattered like fragments of a forgotten dream. A rancher in Durango claimed that an old man, always polite and soft-spoken, paid him in cash to rent a small house in the mountains, a man who never left without a driver, and whose eyes were colder than stone. In Guadalajara, a businessman swore that a mysterious investor had approached him about purchasing a fleet of trucks, the same models once used by the old Federation. Even in Culiacan, locals told stories of seeing him walking into church at dawn, his hat pulled low, a quiet nod to the priest before vanishing into the streets. Each story added a new layer to the legend. For every claim of his death, there was another of his survival. For every supposed grave, another sighting. Over time, his name stopped belonging to a single man. It became an idea, the embodiment of restraint in a world of excess, the symbol of intelligence in a culture of impulsive violence. To the young, restless generation of traffickers, El Azul represented a kind of ghostly perfection, the man who had played the game and walked away. In a strange way, his story also became a form of morality tale. Older narcos used it as a warning, be like Azul, they'd tell their sons. Think before you act. Speak only when necessary. And when your time comes, disappear. His methods, his rules, even his silence were romanticized. Musicians wrote corridos about him, though many were vague, almost reverent, never daring to describe him in too much detail. He was too mysterious for dramatization, too quiet to be glorified in the noisy world of modern narcoculture. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies in both Mexico and the United States continued to list him as one of the most wanted fugitives, even posthumously. His DEA profile remained active for years after the alleged accident, an unusual move that hinted at lingering doubts. Occasionally, intelligence reports surfaced suggesting ongoing financial movements tied to his known aliases. Money continued to flow through businesses he had allegedly established decades earlier. Some agents theorized that his family, possibly even under his direction, was maintaining a low-profile empire, one that operated on stability rather than expansion. The truth was impossible to verify. And perhaps that was the point. What made El Azul so unique was not merely his ability to disappear, but his ability to leave no emotional trace, no rival vengeful enough, no ally betrayed enough, no witness willing to speak. He had structured his life like a sealed vault. Every relationship was balanced by loyalty, every move hidden beneath layers of misdirection. When the time came, he simply closed the vault and walked away, leaving behind nothing but questions. In the years after his supposed death, journalists occasionally revisited his story, attempting to separate fact from fiction. Some found old photographs, blurred, indistinct, of a man who might have been him in the 1980s. Others interviewed retired law enforcement officers who described him as a ghost even when alive. But no one ever produced definitive proof of his death or survival. In the absence of facts, people began to mythologize him the way people once did with old revolutionaries or legendary outlaws. He became a symbol of something deeper, the paradox of the Mexican underworld itself. The man who built empires not through fear, but through patience. The trafficker who believed in balance, who preferred negotiation to bloodshed, who knew that true power was not measured in violence, but in silence. If he truly died in that car crash, then his end was poetic, a quiet exit in keeping with the rhythm of his life. But if he survived, if he still walks the earth somewhere in disguise, then his greatest act was not his empire, but his vanishing. Either way, he achieved what every man in his world secretly desired, to leave the game alive, unbroken, unchained. In the end, El Azul became less a person and more a reflection, a mirror held up to the chaos he once ruled. A reminder that even in the darkest corners of human ambition, there can exist a strange kind of wisdom, that the loudest victory is sometimes silence, and the greatest escape is to simply cease to exist. And so the legend endures, whispered in dimly lit cantinas, murmured in border towns, and immortalized in quiet songs that never name him directly. No one knows for certain where he rests, but in the minds of those who still remember, El Azul will always remain, the quiet narco who survived every war, and perhaps even death itself. Years had passed since the world last heard the name El Azul, and yet his presence seemed to linger like smoke in a closed room, invisible, but impossible to ignore. The cartels that once leaned on his quiet wisdom were now caught in a cycle of endless chaos. The rise of new, younger leaders brought with it new ways of operating, loud, reckless, and impatient. The old guard, the generation of men who remembered Azul's soft-spoken discipline, began to fade away, replaced by a breed of traffickers who treated violence like currency. In that new world, his legacy stood out even more starkly, a monument of restraint amid an age of noise. In the years following his supposed death, journalists and intelligence agencies continued to revisit his legend. Every few months, a rumor would surface, a sighting in Guatemala, a whisper from Colombia, a bank transaction in Panama linked to one of his old companies. None were ever confirmed, and yet each one kept his name alive. It was as if his ghost had become part of the fabric of Mexico's underworld, an invisible force guiding the balance even from beyond the grave. But beneath the myth, there were patterns that suggested something deeper. Financial analysts within the DEA noticed that several businesses linked to old Sinaloa money, transport firms, avocado farms, construction companies, still operated with quiet precision. Their profits were consistent, their taxes paid on time, their transactions unremarkable. And yet, those who followed the paper trail always hit the same dead end, a network of shell companies with no visible owner, their foundations tracing back decades to a single invisible architect, Azul. It was as if he had built a machine that could run without him. People who knew him often described him as an engineer of survival. He didn't just manage men, he managed systems. Networks that could endure wars, arrests, and even the death of their creators. His approach was never about dominance, it was about equilibrium. He treated the drug trade not as chaos to be conquered, but as an organism to be sustained. And though that philosophy was lost on most who came after him, its remnants still echoed through the surviving veins of the Sinaloa Federation. In contrast, the world around that federation was unraveling. The capture and later extradition of El Chapo Guzman to the United States had fractured the once unified structure. His sons, known collectively as Los Chapitos, were too young and impulsive, driven more by pride than prudence. El Mayo Zambada, old and increasingly isolated, maintained a grip on power through alliances and family ties, but even his influence was thinning. Meanwhile, the CJNG expanded with terrifying aggression, using technology, propaganda, and raw brutality to claim territory once considered untouchable. It was a new kind of war, one that Azul would never have engaged in. To understand how deeply the underworld had changed, one only had to look at the numbers: tens of thousands dead, cities turned into battlefields, local economies built on extortion rather than smuggling. The artistry of negotiation had been replaced by the immediacy of violence. And yet, in the quiet spaces between the bloodshed, some still whispered his name with reverence. They said things like, "If Azul were alive, this wouldn't be happening." It was not nostalgia for a gentler cartel, there was no such thing, but for an order that once existed amid the chaos. In these years, several journalists tried to document his life, but writing about El Azul was like trying to describe the color of mist. Even those who had met him admitted they remembered only fragments: the way he spoke softly, the way his eyes seemed to see beyond the present, the way he made you feel like you were part of something much larger. He wasn't charming in the theatrical way of El Chapo, nor intimidating like the Arellano Felix brothers. His power came from composure, the calm in a world built on hysteria. One investigative reporter described visiting his hometown in Badiraguato. The town had changed little, the same dusty roads, the same church, the same mountains looming like silent sentinels. Locals were cautious when asked about him. They didn't deny knowing him, but they didn't confirm much either. "He was a good man," one old farmer said softly. "He helped people. Never showed off, never caused trouble." Others spoke of how he would fund repairs to roads or give money to families whose sons had been arrested or killed. For them, he wasn't a legend, he was a memory of stability. And perhaps that was the true core of his legacy, not the wealth, not the empire, but the idea that even in the darkest corners of crime, balance mattered. He was, in his own way, a philosopher of the underworld, a man who understood that every action, every betrayal, every deal carried consequences that rippled outward. He believed in quiet power, in the kind that didn't need to announce itself. And it was that belief that allowed him to outlive everyone else, or at least to vanish before the world could destroy him. There's a strange kind of peace in imagining what might have become of him. Some imagine him old and content, living somewhere near the Sierra Madre, watching the sun rise over the mountains he once ruled from the shadows. Others picture him walking through a market in Central America, unnoticed, a ghost among the living. Maybe he found what few in his world ever do, an ending of his own choosing. Whatever the truth, the myth of El Azul serves a quiet purpose. It reminds people, even those outside the world of crime, that sometimes survival isn't about being the strongest or the most feared. It's about knowing when to stop fighting. About walking away before the world decides your ending for you. In the greater narrative of Mexico's cartels, he became the counterpoint to El Chapo, the reflection that showed what could have been had restraint triumphed over ego. Where El Chapo became a prisoner of fame, El Azul became a master of obscurity. Where one sought recognition, the other sought silence. And in that silence, he found freedom. Even today, his ghost seems to shape the behavior of those who came after. Some traffickers have begun to emulate his methods. Investing in legitimate businesses, avoiding media attention, keeping their operations small and efficient. Others treat his example as unattainable, a relic of a time when honor still had weight in the underworld. And so, as Mexico's narco landscape continues to evolve, his story lingers as both myth and lesson. His life, or perhaps his legend, serves as a mirror for those who dare to step into the same world he once navigated. It's a reminder that in a realm built on greed, paranoia, and betrayal, there once lived a man who understood that survival required something rarer than courage or cunning, it required stillness. Because, in the end, El Azul's greatest power was not his wealth, nor his alliances, nor even his intelligence. It was his understanding of the one truth every other trafficker ignored, that silence, when used with purpose, could outlast every bullet, every headline, and even death itself. And so his name remains, drifting quietly through history, not shouted, not sung, but whispered. By the late 2010s, the world that El Azul had once balanced so carefully was no longer recognizable. The structure of the cartels had fractured into countless shards, each one fighting for control, each one louder and more brutal than the last. The old codes of silence, the unwritten rules that once governed men like Azul, El Mayo, and even the young Chapo, were now relics of a forgotten time. The new generation had traded patience for speed, subtlety for spectacle. But even in this age of noise, the shadow of El Azul lingered like a ghost story whispered by those who still remembered the value of quiet power. His story had become a myth told in two versions. In one, he was dead, a man who died humbly in a car crash, buried in secret, leaving behind nothing but whispers. In the other, he was still alive, hidden somewhere far away, watching the empire he once guided unravel from a distance. Both stories carried truth, and perhaps, that duality was the essence of who he was, half man, half phantom. By now, his legend had begun to evolve into something larger than any cartel, something cultural, almost spiritual. Young men from Sinaloa, Durango, and Sonora spoke his name in the same tone they used for old saints or soldiers. To them, El Azul represented something lost, not just control or discipline, but a kind of moral order within an immoral world. Even those who despised the drug trade acknowledged that he had been different. He didn't kill for pleasure, one local once said. He killed for balance. He kept the peace, not the chaos. It was this perception that made his legacy so enduring. Because in truth, El Azul's power had never come from violence, it came from influence. His weapon was not the gun, but the pause. The moment of stillness before a decision. The silence that made men think twice. He used quiet the way others used armies. And though the men who followed him couldn't replicate his methods, they envied his results. In the absence of his guidance, old allies drifted apart. The federation that had once ruled over Mexico's drug routes with a delicate hand became a battlefield of pride and blood. Factions loyal to Los Chapitos began clashing with those aligned with El Mayo. The once organized networks fractured into smaller, unpredictable groups, each one vying for control of the corridors that stretched from Culiacan to Nogales. The old balance, the invisible order Azul had maintained for decades, was gone. And yet, the strange thing about his disappearance was that it created not fear, but nostalgia. Even government officials and DEA agents, many of whom had hunted him for years, began to admit in private that El Azul had been the rare criminal who sought to prevent chaos rather than spread it. His intelligence was clinical, his discipline unmatched. Unlike so many others, he had never indulged in luxury or drawn unnecessary attention. He never flaunted power, he embodied it quietly. In interviews years later, some retired intelligence officers reflected on what his absence had meant. You could always tell when Azul was around, one said. Things stayed calm. Territories respected their lines. Violence was minimal. The moment he vanished, everything went red. His ability to mediate had not only kept the Sinaloa cartel stable, but had also restrained Mexico's broader criminal ecosystem. Rival groups, even those who never met him directly, respected the balance he imposed. When disputes arose, Azul didn't threaten, he reasoned. When tensions escalated, he found common ground. He understood that every bullet fired created a ripple that could not be undone. To him, survival depended on precision, not passion. That precision extended beyond the battlefield and into business. He had been one of the first traffickers to fully grasp the global nature of narcotics, that drugs were not just about supply, but about logistics, distribution, and market control. He cultivated networks in Central America, South America, and the United States, always ensuring that operations remained stable and under control. His quiet genius lay not in ambition, but in maintenance. He didn't build empires to expand endlessly, he built systems to last. Now, years after his disappearance, financial analysts and crime reporters began uncovering traces of that system still in motion. Shipping companies, trucking lines, and small agricultural firms tied to his name continued to operate across multiple countries. The money moved slowly, deliberately, as if still guided by an unseen hand. To those who followed the numbers, it was as if El Azul's design had outlived him, a self-sustaining network that could function indefinitely, even without its architect. Meanwhile, in the hills of Sinaloa, locals began to speak of strange sightings once more. An older man, always wearing a wide-brimmed hat, had been seen visiting a small chapel at sunrise. He never spoke to anyone, but always left donations for the church. Some said he resembled an old photograph of Azul from the 1980s, lean, reserved, polite. Whether true or not, the rumor was enough to keep the myth alive. But beyond the speculation, there was a sense that his presence, real or imagined, had become part of Mexico's cultural memory. Songs, novels, and even documentaries referenced him, but always indirectly, as if invoking his name directly might disturb something sacred. To this day, no mainstream narco corrido dares to glorify him openly. His image was not made for dramatization, it was too quiet, too complex. He was not the story that sells, he was the story that haunts. In a way, El Azul became the embodiment of everything his world had lost. Where the modern cartels sought fame, he had sought anonymity. Where others killed for dominance, he had killed to preserve peace. Where others built empires of ego, he built systems of survival. That contrast, between noise and silence, chaos and control, became the lens through which his life was remembered. Even his enemies, those who once stood on the opposite side of negotiations, spoke of him with reluctant admiration. He understood respect, said one former rival captured years later. He didn't need to scream. One look, one word, and you knew not to cross him. Perhaps that was his true genius, not that he avoided death, but that he avoided hatred. In a business where every relationship ended in betrayal, he somehow managed to leave no trail of bitterness behind. Those who worked with him didn't hate him when he was gone, they missed him. And that, in the brutal logic of the narco world, was unheard of. As the 2020s began, with cartel wars raging across Mexico and new generations trying, and failing, to impose order, El Azul's name resurfaced in an unlikely way. Scholars and journalists began citing him not just as a criminal figure, but as a socio-political study, an example of how power can exist without spectacle. His strategies were analyzed in academic papers, his negotiations dissected in think tanks. Somewhere between myth and history, the man had transformed into an archetype, the invisible leader, the strategist who mastered survival through calm. And perhaps, in some remote corner of the Sierra Madre, an old man smiled at the thought, amused that the world still wondered, still searched, still spoke his name in half-whispers. Whether he lived or died, El Azul had achieved something no one else in his world ever did, he became timeless. Not through fear, not through fame, but through silence, the rarest power of all. By the early 2020s, Mexico's criminal landscape had entered yet another phase of transformation, a new cycle of violence and shifting alliances that mirrored the chaos of decades past, yet felt unfamiliar in its intensity. The world of the narcos had grown younger, faster, and more erratic. Technology replaced trust, social media replaced secrecy. What had once been a shadowy empire now operated partly in the open, with younger traffickers flaunting power and wealth on the internet, something El Azul would have found both foolish and fatal. In those years, the world around him, or perhaps around his memory, seemed to drift further from the principles that had defined his life. His methods, based on invisibility and balance, were no longer the rule, they were an anomaly. And yet, despite being gone from sight for nearly a decade, his legend began to experience a quiet resurgence. People spoke of him not as a ghost anymore, but as a lost philosopher, the last man who had understood that true power didn't come from dominance, but from endurance. Documentaries and podcasts began exploring his story in greater depth. Unlike the sensationalist portrayals of El Chapo Guzman, which thrived on escape stories and cinematic gunfights, the tone around El Azul was different. Softer. Reflective. He wasn't painted as a hero or a monster, but as a mystery, a man who existed between morality and madness, who survived by knowing when to stop. These retellings didn't seek to glorify him, they sought to understand him. In these narratives, one theme kept returning, El Azul's ability to remain unseen in a world built on exposure. As one journalist wrote, he lived in the same storm as everyone else, but he never let the rain touch him. The deeper these storytellers dug, the more they found traces of a life defined not by chaos, but by control. Former associates described him as meticulous, a man who reviewed every deal, every shipment, every word spoken in his name. He had a rule that his men remembered well: if you can't explain it calmly, you shouldn't do it at all. That philosophy was more than a motto, it was the core of his survival. While others thrived on adrenaline, Azul thrived on patience. His story also became a lens through which people began to examine Mexico's ongoing tragedy. Politicians, sociologists, and writers alike drew contrasts between the old and new generations of traffickers. The older era, despite its crimes, operated under a form of pragmatic order, a cold equilibrium between corruption and control. But the new era was defined by chaos, young leaders killing without purpose, local militias rising without ideology, communities trapped between fear and poverty. It became easy, then, for people to romanticize the past, to see Azul's era as a time of rules, even if they were rules born in darkness. But beyond nostalgia, there was something deeper at play, a longing for restraint in a world addicted to extremes. Azul symbolized that restraint, the idea that even in corruption, there could exist calculation, that even among wolves, there could exist wisdom. His legend also began to take on a moral undertone in popular culture. Corridos about him were subdued, rarely naming him directly, and never celebrating violence. Instead, they described silence, intelligence, and disappearance. The rhythm of those songs was slower, the lyrics reflective: he left before the storm, and no one saw him go. In the modern narco ballads, full of boasting and brutality, his image was like a sigh, a reminder of what had been lost. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies continued to maintain his file, though many suspected it was more out of habit than necessity. His DEA record remained marked as unconfirmed deceased, a bureaucratic ghost in a system that couldn't quite decide whether to close the case. Occasionally, small intelligence fragments would surface, a bank account reactivated in Panama, a land purchase in Honduras under an alias from the 1980s. Each new clue reignited curiosity: had he truly died, or had he simply erased himself so perfectly that he now lived beyond detection? Within Mexico, locals began to treat his name with quiet reverence. Unlike other capos, whose faces adorned murals and shirts, Azul's legacy was invisible, a whisper shared by older generations who remembered his way of keeping the peace. In villages across Sinaloa and Durango, people would still tell the young, things were calmer when Azul was around. Whether that calm was real or imagined didn't matter, it had become part of collective memory, a myth built on the longing for a steadier past. In that sense, El Azul had transcended the boundaries of crime and entered folklore. His story no longer belonged only to history, it belonged to the imagination of a nation still searching for balance. For some, he was the proof that even in sin there could be order. For others, he was the warning that intelligence, no matter how sharp, could never escape the cost of its own world. And yet, what made his story so haunting was its incompleteness. Every account, every investigation, every documentary ended the same way, with a question mark. That uncertainty became the very essence of his identity. Like fog rolling through the Sierra Madre, he was always there, yet never fully seen. As one retired Mexican intelligence officer said in an interview years later, Azul didn't disappear, he just learned how to exist in a way that no one else could track. Maybe that's what freedom really is. Not running. Not hiding. Just no longer needing to be found. In a world obsessed with attention, El Azul represented the opposite, the power of absence. He had taught, through his example, that silence could be louder than violence, and that legacy wasn't built by being remembered, but by refusing to be erased. That realization resonated deeply with the Mexican people, especially those living through endless waves of narco wars. In a culture where violence had become constant background noise, his story became a rare kind of lullaby, slow, calm, tragic, but strangely comforting. It was the story of a man who lived surrounded by war yet never surrendered to it. A man who learned how to survive by disappearing, not from the world, but from the expectations that destroyed everyone else. And as that myth continued to grow, a strange question began to surface among storytellers, musicians, and even historians: was El Azul a criminal genius, or simply a man who wanted peace in a world that couldn't allow it? The answer, like everything about him, remained somewhere in between. In the end, what kept his legend alive was not the power he wielded, nor the fear he inspired, but the mystery he left behind. Because while others in his world were buried in headlines, prisons, and graves, El Azul became something rarer, a whisper that refused to fade. And perhaps that whisper was the closest thing to immortality he ever wanted. The turn of the millennium marked the beginning of a new era, one of chaos, betrayal, and shifting loyalties. The world that El Azul had helped build was changing rapidly, like an old empire crumbling under the weight of its own ambition. Where once alliances were crafted with quiet words and handshakes, now they were broken with bullets and headlines. The new generation of traffickers sought fame and dominance through violence, through spectacle. Azul, ever the strategist, saw this shift with quiet disappointment. He had spent decades perfecting the art of invisibility, only to watch a younger breed destroy that sacred code in a haze of greed and arrogance. He moved differently now, slower, quieter, and even more deliberate. By this time, Azul had learned that the greatest protection was not in power or soldiers, but in the fading of one's own image. His name appeared less in the reports, his movements became rumors, and even his most trusted lieutenants rarely knew where he was. Some nights, he was said to stay in modest ranches in Durango, sleeping under stars instead of chandeliers. Other nights, he disappeared into the capital's chaos, blending among businessmen who had no idea who sat beside them. For those who still served him, loyalty was no longer commanded, it was chosen. They followed him not out of fear, but because of what he represented, the last trace of order in a world consumed by noise. He didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. A simple instruction, a quiet glance, was enough. In a life filled with loud men, Azul remained a whisper, and a whisper, in the right ear, could still change everything. He often reflected on the years behind him, the betrayals, the shifting alliances, the countless faces that had come and gone. Men he once called partners were now either dead, imprisoned, or ghosts in exile. The world he once navigated so carefully had grown unrecognizable. The cartels had split, multiplied, and torn each other apart. Azul watched from afar, detached yet thoughtful, as though observing the fall of an empire he had once helped design. But despite his detachment, he wasn't entirely gone. He still moved pieces when it mattered. Sometimes his influence appeared subtly, like a shadow behind political decisions or quiet truces between rival factions. The government, even as it hunted ghosts, treated his name with an odd reverence. He was not the loud threat that made headlines, he was the quiet uncertainty that lingered behind every operation. It was around this time that people began to call him El Fantasma Azul, the Blue Ghost. It wasn't a title he asked for, but it fit. He was everywhere and nowhere, a rumor that refused to die. Some claimed to have seen him driving alone through desert roads, his face aged but calm. Others swore he was dead, his body buried in a secret grave known only to a few. Yet, every time his name was pronounced, something in the air shifted, an invisible reminder that silence, too, was power. He had reached a state that few in his world ever achieved, freedom without exposure, control without attention. He no longer chased wealth or influence, he had both in abundance, but they no longer interested him. What fascinated him now was peace, the kind that can only exist when a man chooses to disappear from the noise he once ruled. And so, Azul began to withdraw, piece by piece. No grand announcements, no final meetings, no farewell speeches. He simply stepped back and let the chaos unfold without him. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to live like a shadow among ordinary men. Those who still whispered his name knew the truth, he wasn't gone. He had simply learned that the greatest act of power wasn't to rule the world, but to walk away from it, quietly, and let it burn itself to ash. As the years unfolded, El Azul learned the true meaning of invisibility. While other figures in the narco world battled for headlines and territory, he drifted quietly between shadows, unseen, unbothered, untouchable. His name stopped appearing in reports, but those who understood power knew he was still there, somewhere, watching the chaos from a distance. The new generation of cartels rose violently, loud and reckless. They painted messages on walls, posted videos, and waged wars that had no end. Azul saw it all as proof that the old ways had died. The discipline he once enforced, silence, patience, control, was gone. He had no desire to fight for a world that no longer spoke his language. Whispers said he withdrew completely, cutting contact even with former allies. Some claimed he lived in the mountains under protection, others that he'd retired to a quiet estate by the Pacific. The truth was irrelevant, his absence became his shield. In a landscape built on betrayal, Azul's disappearance was his triumph. He had played the game longer than anyone, and when the game turned poisonous, he simply walked away. The war continued without him, loud and bloody, but his silence said everything. By the time the world began to wonder what had become of him, El Azul had already transformed from a man into a myth. Newspapers speculated, governments denied, and enemies stayed cautious, uncertain if he was dead, or simply waiting. His name carried the kind of respect that fear alone couldn't create. Legends began to take shape, stories of a soft-spoken old man who visited small villages with gifts, or a stranger who paid hospital bills before disappearing again. None were proven, but each one deepened his mystique. Azul had become less a person than a presence, an echo of control in a world that had lost it. To some, his survival was luck. To others, genius. But maybe it was something simpler, awareness. He knew when to retreat, when to let silence do the speaking. In his absence, his philosophy spread quietly through those who studied his methods: patience over pride, order over chaos, reason over rage. And so, while his peers met violent ends, Azul's name became eternal. He had turned his life into an idea, calm, measured, and forever beyond reach. As years passed, El Azul's legend drifted quietly through Mexico's memory, no longer the story of a criminal, but of a survivor who outlived his wars. He was said to have vanished into silence: no arrests, no gunfights, no witnesses. Just a fading trail that ended somewhere between rumor and eternity. Some whispered he'd retired to a coastal town, tending to gardens and reading newspapers. Others claimed he'd died long ago, buried under another name. Yet the mystery itself became his monument. His calmness turned into philosophy. To some, it meant discipline; to others, patience. Younger generations in the underworld invoked his name not as a threat, but as a lesson, that control and invisibility were greater powers than fear. Even journalists, poets, and scholars began quoting him like a thinker rather than a trafficker. The color blue, Azul, became symbolic of his story: deep, endless, and still. He was remembered not for bloodshed but for his quiet mastery of time. While empires rose and fell, his silence endured. He became both man and myth, both warning and wisdom. And so, his presence lingered like a faint shadow, felt, not seen. People spoke of him softly, as if afraid to disturb the calm he'd left behind. El Azul had done what few men ever could: he survived every war, and then disappeared into peace. In the end, El Azul's story feels less like a biography and more like a whisper carried on the night wind. No one knows where he truly rests, perhaps by the sea, perhaps in legend alone. What remains is the sense that he mastered the art of vanishing while still being remembered. His silence became his final victory. Where others fell to pride or chaos, he chose stillness. His legacy was not built on noise, but on calm endurance. Even those who never met him speak his name with quiet awe, as though invoking a ghost who watches without judgment. His life reminds us that power isn't only in force, it's in restraint, in knowing when to fade. Azul's tale ends not with an explosion, but with a sigh. The sea moves, the night deepens, and the world keeps turning. Somewhere in that vast stillness, his name continues to drift, soft, patient, eternal. El Azul. The quiet narco who survived every war, and then outlived his own story.